by not answering this very important question of what is a woman, many women have been very harmed along the process. See, by not answering this question of what is a woman, people have been brutally affected by this. You guys remember the Paris Olympics where a male, someone that was a biological male, was put in the ring against a female. Or the first ever MMA trans fighter called Fallon Fox, she got in the ring with a woman. This woman didn't even know that she was versing a biological man. And this was somebody that had only transitioned a few years before the fight. So had lived as a man all of his life. A few years before this fight, transitions, becomes a female, because apparently you can just identify as a woman despite your biology and genetic makeup, gets in the ring with a woman, fractures her skull, and leaves 8 staples in her head. Or you hear of stories, this is probably one of the best and most tragic examples of why not answering the question of what is a woman causes a lot of problems in society. A few years ago in California, there was a young 17-year-old man, and he sexually assaulted a 10-year-old girl in a public restaurant bathroom. But they didn't find out about it until he was 23. And in California, you don't go to jail versus juvenile based on the age of the age you are when you're in the trial. You go based on the age when you committed it. And this man, 23 at the time, in trial, being sentenced, he happens to decide during the trial, I'm gonna transition to be a female. I think I wanna become a woman instead. So he transitions during his trial, and you know what the judge did? The judge put a 23-year-old biological male into a female-only, under 18, female juvenile center. So a biological man who has sexually assaulted young girls is now with all of these young girls in a juvenile center. So to the people that say, what does it matter what a woman is? Why do we have to answer what is a woman? We have to answer what is a woman, because if we do not define it, then women end up being harmed in the process. If we do not define what a woman is and the fact that she must be protected by strong men, if we don't define that, then women end up being victimized. And this week we saw a great victory in the United States of America because we saw Donald Trump, he signed an executive order to have no men in women's sports any longer. Now you can't just identify as a female, get in the ring and punch a woman and be celebrated for it, but he signed an order saying, and I love that he didn't call it no trans women. He didn't call it no trans women in women's sports. He called it what it was, no men in women's sports. Praise God. This week we celebrated the fact that a man's strength is not something to violate women. Men's strength is not something to overpower women. It's not to take advantage of women. The Bible says that women are the weaker vessels, so husbands are to show more understanding and more respect, so the world realized this week that God gave men their strength not to overpower and victimize women, but to protect women. God gave men their strength to be able to protect women. Women need to be cherished. Women need to be protected. Femininity needs to be protected. The definition of what a woman is, it needs to be protected. Society wants to destroy what we believe about womanhood. Society wants to tell you that the things that make us a woman, the fact that we can bring life into this world, society wants to rob that of women and say that men can get pregnant. Society wants to take away that which makes us a woman, what God designed for us. And we must take back what is sacred and what belongs to God. So tonight we're going to discuss what is biblical womanhood. What is biblical femininity? What does God say about it? And we have to talk, how did we get here? How did we land here where biological men are able to get in a ring and punch a woman? How do we get here? How do we get so far where we're saying there's, sex and gender are two different things and you can identify as whatever you want to, that your gender is just how you feel on the inside and it's got nothing to do with your biological sex? How did we get here? And the answer is the feminist movement, which is kind of weird because it seems sort of counterintuitive and counterproductive that a movement that's supposed to be about women ended up harming women in the process. It's kind of strange. So we have to look at the history of feminism and we have to ask ourselves, what were the motives of feminism all along? What was this whole movement about? Because a lot of Christians, what we understand is that feminism was just about women being able to vote. It's just about women being able to work. And this sounds like that sounds fine, that sounds good. What's wrong with that? Is this the true motive behind the feminist movement? So when we look at the history of feminism, we break it up into a series of waves. So when we look back at history, we look at the number of waves. So the first wave we look at is 1840s to 1920s, and then we say the second wave was around the 1960s to the 1990s, and then 1990 to 2010, and then all the way to right now. This is how we break up the history of feminism. And when we look at the first wave of feminism, we have voices like Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was someone who said, okay, we need to bring rights for women. We want women to have the same sort of rights as men, the right to vote, the right to own land, the right to be able to work, and at this point we're okay with this. There doesn't seem anything wrong with this, where we can get on board with this. But this was not just what she was all about. This is how it might have been framed, but this wasn't her motive. See, what Mary Wollstonecraft made very, very known is her hatred of the whole idea of submission and a hierarchy in the home. She made it very clear that she hated the idea of a woman being a helper. She hated this idea. And we see this even more so with her own daughter, Mary Shelley, who followed in her footsteps, who wrote the book Frankenstein. And Mary Shelley, you need to understand, this is the beginning of feminism. Mary Shelley had the view of Satan, that Satan wasn't the bad guy. Satan was actually the good guy and God was the bad guy. Because Satan was a justified rebel that was protecting humanity from a tyrannical God. So she believed that God is a tyrant, and that the serpent was coming to tell Eve, he's trying to control you. I just need to set you free from a tyrannical God. This was her point of view. And then you see people like John Stuart Mill, same sort of idea as these two women. John Stuart Mill, he said, women are forced. Women are forced to duties as wives and mothers because the whole force of education enslaves women's minds to such roles. But what was education like at this point? It was Christian. He's talking about the Bible. He's saying that women are forced into these roles because they've been brainwashed by the Bible. This guy has a problem with the Bible, with Judeo-Christian values. He said, marriage is the only actual bondage known to our law. There remain no legal slaves except the mistress of every house. So he looks at every woman in her house, serving her children, serving her husband. That right there is a slave. That's a slave. And often we thought that feminism, the movement, was about, protecting women from very violent men. It was about protecting women from things like domestic violence. But what you need to understand is that these reformers, these feminist voices and activists, they had a problem without there being any male violence. Even if there was no male violence or domestic abuse, they have a problem, because what they have a problem with right there is the fact that women are helpers in the home. They hate the fact. They hate authority. They hate the idea of authority. God is a tyrant. He restricts us. He puts boundaries on us. In 1920, a bunch of women 1848, 200 women gathered together at what's called the Seneca Falls Convention. They gathered together. Women love their mums' clubs. They love to come together and chat. Well, this was the first mums' club. They come together, and now the movement is beginning to mobilize. It's beginning to gain momentum. It is now a full-blown movement of women. Then in 1916, you have someone called Margaret Sanger. She opened up the very first birth control clinic. She introduced the contraceptive pill. So she was now telling women, you don't have to be a slave to these children of yours. You can decide, I don't need to have children. I get to go and follow my ambitions. I get to go and live however I want to live. I can have sex with whoever I want to, as much as I want to, and there will not be the burden of children. This is first wave feminism. Now, second wave feminism, well, you got to understand, if this was just about women getting votes, We think that feminism was just about votes. It would have stopped in 1920 when the amendment was changed so that women could vote. But it was never just about women being able to vote. It was never just about women being able to own land. There was a much greater motive and a much bigger agenda behind the scenes. And so it continues. The movement continues. Second wave feminism. Now, this is not just about rights. We want to just abolish the entire idea of being a mother and being a wife. Like what they were kind of already pointing to. We hate the idea of someone that is a wife serving their husband. We hate the idea of someone that is a mother and having children. And this is where you get what happened today, this week with J.D. Vance, the term wife being offensive. It all started back in 1960s. You have a woman called Simone D. She's French. I'm not going to bother. It's too hard. Let's just call her Simone, okay? You have this woman, she's a very left, very socialist woman, one of the biggest voices in the feminist movement. Now she comes and says, the female is just a female in so much as she feels herself as one. So being a woman, that's got nothing to do with the roles outlined in the Bible. It's all to do with if you feel like you're a woman, then you're a woman. She says one is not born a woman, but becomes one. Some essential biological givens are not part of her lived situation. She says the structure of the ovum, so the reproductive cells only in women that are able to bring life. She says this has nothing to do with being a woman. The clitoris, on the other hand, plays a primary role. So the structure that only gives you sexual pleasure, she's saying that's what defines what a woman is. It's got nothing to do with the ability to have children. It's got nothing to do with the ability to bring life into this earth. It's all about sexual promiscuity. And then people said, but it kind of seems like people want to have children. People were critiquing her ideas. They were like, it kind of seems like it is a very vital part of being a woman, having children, because a lot of women seem to want to have babies. And her response was, no. They don't want that. They're just being brainwashed. They read myths and they read stories and it's also male dominated. And so little girls grow up thinking this, but it's not true. And she went so extreme that she said no woman should be authorized to stay at home and raise her children. So now she's like, we've got to use force so that women aren't allowed to stay home and do this role. She said society should be totally different. Women should not have the choice. Because if there is a choice to stay home with her children, then too many women will choose that. It's a way of forcing women in a certain direction. So she was like, women, they're so ingrained that this is the part of who they are, because it is, having children. She's like, we got to force them not to do it. We got to make it impossible for them to be able to stay home and be mothers. So she would love the current political climate, because the reality is the current economy, for most women, they don't have the option to be able to stay home. She would love that because women are forced. You have people like Betty Friedan. She said that that motherhood and being a wife is a comfortable concentration camp. This is the picture of being a wife and a mother. You are basically a Jew living in Nazi Germany with a bed. You're living in a concentration camp. Your home is a concentration camp, but it's kind of comfortable. You got a bed, you got a pillow. But apart from that, you are a Jew living in Nazi Germany. This was the idea. This is not about women getting to vote. This was a redefining of what being a woman is, what being a mother is. And this was so ironic about the feminist movement. This is what's so ironic. The things that feminists will hate men for, traits like, they'll hate on men and they'll say that all men, they're just so ambitious and they don't care about their families and they're never home to be with their families. Or all men, they just sleep around, they're so promiscuous. The things that feminists hate men for, they're also telling women, you should do these things to feel fulfillment. That's what's so ironic about it. They're telling women, you need to be less relational. You need to care less about your babies and care more about your ambitions and your career. So they're hating on men for this stuff, but then they're also telling you, how does this stuff make sense? How are they hating on men, but also saying we need to be equal to men? It's like, do you hate them or do you want to be equal to them? Like, what's going on here? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And now third wave feminism, it's now we're moving beyond womanhood like entirely. Now we're not even talking about womanhood at all. We're talking strictly about gender. The third wave feminists, now they want to convince you that gender is just a social construct, that gender and sex are two different things. Welcome to 2025, where apparently gender is something that you just get to decide, that if I feel like being a woman, I can put on lipstick and call it a day, and now apparently I'm a female because gender is a social construct. I can portray myself however I want. And you have people like Shulamith Firestone. See, at this point, you're like, how does this have anything to do with women anymore? Like, we're not even talking about women anymore. That's the point. Feminism wasn't about the values of women. Look at what this one of the main activists, feminists, wrote. She said the end goal of the feminist revolution must be unlike that of the first. Not just the elimination of male privilege, but of the sex distinction itself. So genital differences don't mean anything in culture anymore. And now we see that this was never about women. But this was a full-blown attack on gender itself, how God had defined male and female. This was not about women being able to be valued. This was not about women gaining rights. This was merely pointing the finger at God, saying, you designed gender? Well, I don't subscribe to your idea of gender. This was people saying, I don't care what you said about male and female, that you said that we are different. I get to be whoever I want to be. If I want to be the dominant one in the marriage, let me be the dominant one. This was not about women. This was not just an anti-female movement. This was an anti-God movement because it looked at God. It looked at God's creation. It looked at what God did in the garden when he created male and female. And they said, we do not subscribe to the biblical view of gender.